Hello friends and welcome, I'm VA Adam. In today's video I will be showing you how I replace the steering column rubber boot, or as it's known in the workshop manual, the abrasion shield, on my 1972 Buick Riviera. Let's have a look at where this part is and what it looks like at the moment. Here's the steering column running through the engine bay all the way down to the joint just here. There is the rubber boot that we are going to be replacing, and you can see here how damaged and worn mine is. It's actually completely separated into two different pieces, and to be honest, it's not really doing anything to keep out the dirt and the debris. The first thing that we need to do is get the column removed from the joint end here. There is a plastic cover that goes over this area to protect it. I've already removed mine, and mine was actually already broken into a couple of pieces. I think the reason for this is that if you want to remove this, you need to remove the power steering lines. Previous person must have just snapped it in two to get it off, which was easier, I guess. Once that's off and out of the way, you can see here that there's two nuts connected to two bolts. There are two more bolts here, but those don't have any nuts on, they're just running through these cutouts to sort of help guide it in. Now, before you start getting these nuts off, remember that they're probably going to be seized in place. I'm going to give you 4 tips for dealing with these nuts and bolts that you'll hopefully find really useful. Tip number 1, spray the nut. Make sure to spray them with a lot of good penetrative spray. This is the one that I use and I find it works really well. Leave it for about 5 minutes to work through, and you can even spray it on a few times if it's really corroded. Tip 2, tap the nut. It's starting to sound a bit rude, isn't it? Give the nut and bolt a few taps with a hammer. You don't need to whack it, just give them a firm tap and it will help loosen up any rust that's bonded the two pieces of the metal together. Tip number 3, tap the socket. When you put the socket onto the nut, take a minute and just make sure it's seated really well. Once you're sure, just give it a little tap with the hammer. You'll probably be quite surprised that most of the time it will just drop down another millimetre or two. Watch how my socket here drops down just a little when it's struck with a hammer, even though I couldn't push it on anymore with my hand. Now, it doesn't seem like much, but that's going to make a big difference to the surface area when you're gripping and trying to turn the nut. Tip number 4, give yourself room. If you have a bolt like this where it's really difficult to get the wrench in, just use extension bars. Rather than trying to get the wrench in here and wrestling around and not giving yourself enough room to turn, just use extension bars. You can keep adding extension bars and get the wrench out of the really tight space. This gives you more room to turn, makes it easier to apply pressure evenly so that you're not twisting the socket off of the nut or off of the bolt, which is what will cause it to round. Bonus tip. I didn't do this myself here, but I have had it suggested to me that tightening the nut before loosening it can help. This allows you to crack the corrosion before loosening it. I'm not entirely sure why that would be preferable, but I believe the thinking is that if you're tightening it, there's less chance of the nut suddenly breaking loose and risking snapping the bolt or snapping part of the nut or maybe rounding or your hand flying off or something like that. If you know about this tip, or even better if you've used it and it's worked, please let me know in the comments section below. So anyway, back to the process. When the nut is on the right or in the upright position, it's much easier to access with your wrench in this area. What I did was I cracked one nut loose in this position, then I turned the steering wheel so that the other bolt and the other nut was accessible. You can turn the wheel even with these nuts loose, they won't break off or anything like that. If you want to make it easier though, what you can do is simply just jack the front of the car up and that will lift the wheels off of the ground, and then you'll just be able to turn it way easier without having the weight of the car on the steering. You could also just turn the engine on to engage your power steering, but if you've had to remove the power steering lines to get that plastic boot off that I mentioned earlier, you know, that won't end so well. So once you have these off, you need to separate the column from the joint here. I used a screwdriver with the bit taken out. What I did was I popped it over the bolt and just gave it a few whacks with a hammer, and that loosened it on one side. I then turned the steering wheel again and did the same on the opposite side, and that helped it separate from the joint. Once you have that separated, the next part is to remove the collar at the top here. There's just a single nut and bolt holding this in place. Once you've removed those using the same tips that I gave you earlier, you'll probably just need to pry the collar apart. Here's a better view of what the collar looks like, and you can see how it wraps around and isn't a solid unit. It's got this gap in it. Now this can be loosened by prying it apart, and you can do that by using the technique that I've used here if you don't have a special tool for it, which is just using a couple of flare spanners. What you do is you place one spanner in one end so that it hooks over the gap in the collar that the bolt goes through, and then you do the same on the other side, and as you sort of pull them apart from each other, they lock into each other and it will pry the collar apart. A word of warning though, don't loosen the collar too much. When you come to put this back together, if you loosen the collar too much, it will be a real pain to get this bolt back through, and yes, I did make that mistake, but more on that later. Once you have the collar loose, you can start removing the column itself. Before you do that, wrap a bit of masking tape around the column and put a mark on it so that you know which side is the top. I do believe this column only goes back on one way around, but it's just easier to identify it when you're putting it back on. You can see here how the column is held onto this ridged shaft which attaches to the steering wheel. It will be on there very, very tightly, so what you're going to have to do is lift the column up on the joint end, and once you've done that, just use a punch or a bar or something that you can hit the column with the hammer, and it will slowly start to pull it off of the ridge shaft. Now, you've got to be very careful when you're hitting this column with a hammer, either when you're taking it off or when you're hitting it with a hammer to put on, which we'll cover at the end of the video. The reason for this is because there's two small plastic pins. You can see one of them here. These plastic pins hold the two parts of the column together, and they're actually a really early safety feature. So in the event of a front impact, what would happen is the steering column would be compressed, these plastic pins would break, and the column would slide up over itself rather than going straight into the cabin and impaling the driver. Always preferable. So I've got this off now, and let's get it out of the engine bay, and then we can have a proper look at the column, see all the different parts. So here's the column out of the engine bay now, and here is the part that was attached to the joint, with the areas where the bolts went through. Here's the old boot. You can see how it's completely destroyed, so we're going to have to make sure we get that all off before we put the new one on, of course. And here is the collar that went on the end, and finally the ridges and the grooves, and these lock into the ridges and grooves on the shaft on the car that's connected to the steering wheel that we saw earlier. I've now taken the coupling assembly off of the top. There's a circular spring metal clip that's holding the boot in place. You just need to get a screwdriver in there or a prying tool and just push that out, just work that out so that it will come off loose, and then you can slide this coupling assembly off. It's not actually held in with anything other than the spring clip that's holding the boot and sort of keeping it all held together. It will just slide off, but there is a little hole in the end here where you can put a small screwdriver down the end. If it's a bit stiff, you can just push it out. This is actually part of the tilt steering column feature of the Rivieras and just allows it to flex. There's a lot of grease in here, so we're going to give this a really good clean up, and then we'll come back to it. Here it now is all cleaned up, and the new boot is on there already. Now I'll come to that in just a bit as to how I got that on. And I just wanted to show you some parts on the end here. So you can see there's a couple of bearings on the end here and a spring piece in between them. That's what goes into the coupling assembly that we removed just a minute ago. Getting the new boot on was really, really difficult because I couldn't get this pin on the end out. I'm not really sure how it releases. The way I did this was I got the boot over one of the end of the pins. I then sort of bunched it up so that it had the room to move without the pin pushing on the inside of the boot. Once that's done, I just slid it over as far as I could, and I used a dash tool to just stretch it out over the other pin. The boot was actually really, really strong, and it didn't get damaged at all. It didn't even feel like it was going to break. It just felt like it was very stiff, and it was kind of at the limit of its ability to go over this pin. It's obviously really, really tough, and the neck here is actually got a metal core in it, just like the old one. If you're doing it this way, I would say just be careful to make sure that you don't pierce the boot with the dash removal tool or whatever you're using to sort of help you get it over the end of the pin there. So I've got the bearings here with the spring in that I mentioned earlier, and I've put that all back on in place. I filled the coupling assembly with a lot of grease, and this is the grease that I used. Everything is in the description below if you need any links. Once this is in place, just slide the coupling assembly onto the end of the steering column as it was before. I found that the new boot was a little bit smaller than the original, and this left a gap around the outside. This boot isn't actually specifically for a 1972 Buick Riviera, I just had to get one that was a close match. Now what this has meant is that the spring clip won't actually hold it in place well enough. So to compensate for that, what I did was I took the neck off of the old boot and I kind of used it as a big washer effectively. To do this, you need to cut it away from the old boot, then you need to shave down as much rubber as you can and make it as thin as you can. The reason for this is because the recess here only has a limited depth, and with both the new boot neck in and the original boot neck in, it sort of overfills the recess, but it can just squeeze in if you shave off a lot of the rubber on the old one. So once that's done, cut one side with a hacksaw if you haven't already, and then pry it open, slide it over the column and then push it back together. You'll then be able to slide it down the column onto the new boot, and that will fill out the space. You can then put the spring clip on, and once you've got the spring clip on, you can push it down and it will keep everything held in place. Now I did have to use a hammer and a screwdriver just to tap the spring clip down enough and then get it to ping up into the retaining gap here, but it did work and it held it in very, very securely. So unfortunately on mine, the clip which is holding on the lower part of the boot has actually just snapped because it's so old. So I'm going to temporarily use some zip ties to just hold it down in place. But I will replace these with Jubilee clip once I've managed to get hold of one. So here's everything reassembled and ready to go back into the engine bay. You can give the coupling assembly a movement and a flex just to make sure it's all moving freely. According to the workshop manual, the gap between this part of the column and the start of the boot should be 6 3/16 inches. I'm not too sure why it's got to be that precise, but I measured it and that's the measurement that I've used when securing it back in place. So here's the column back in, and something important to consider when putting this column back in is that the ridge and groove shafts that we looked at earlier, those grooves will determine how lined up your steering wheel is going to be, right? Because one end is the steering column and one end is the steering wheel. I actually had to disconnect and reconnect mine about 5 or 6 times to get it right. Hopefully you won't need that many goes. Before you start putting it on, make sure you apply some grease to the grooved spindle. It's quite tricky to align, that's why I had to do it so many times, because if you could just attach the column to the joint end first with the bolts, it'd be easy. It would just slide straight on, it would be aligned perfectly. But the problem is you can't. You have to attach the grooved end first, which is just turning freely because it's just attached to the steering wheel. So you need to make sure that the wheels are lined up dead straight. Then what you need to do is you need to try and line the column up by eye with the bolts and try and get it in the right place. Slide it over the grooved end, tap it with a hammer to get it on, just be careful, like I said, the pins earlier, and once you've put it on, you then need to slide it down over the bolts, and hopefully your measurement with the eye earlier will mean that it's gone over the bolts and it's in the right place. Once you've got it in the right place, just to reattach the washers and the nuts, you might want to reattach them, but just don't sort of do them right up and don't attach the plastic guard and everything yet. You might want to just put it in loosely, just take it down the road and just see how lined up the steering wheel is. That's what I had to do. You might remember earlier that I mentioned about the collar and prying it apart too much. If you end up doing that like I did, then what will happen is you won't be able to get the bolt through very easily. You can try and squeeze it back together. Maybe you've got a tool that will do that, but I tried all sorts of different things. I even put a G-clamp on there to try and get it pushed back together, but it actually just twisted the G-clamp. So mine wouldn't sort of squeeze back together by using any tools. What I had to do in the end was I had to put the bolt through, I had to put the bolt through so that it was kind of just aligned with the other side of the collar, and then I whacked it with a hammer using a bar, and that pushed it through just enough to get the thread poking out the other end so that I could get a nut on, and then I put the nut on and tightened it down. The other thing when you're putting on all of these nuts onto these bolts is make sure you use some really good anti-seize. I've got a good one in the description down below that I use whenever I'm taking off nuts and bolts on these old cars. It will just help prevent the bolts rusting together again in the future. It will be a lot easier if you need to remove the bolts in the future and do this work again, or if you need to work on anything else. So as always guys, thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and until next time, this is V8 Adam signing off.